The sun was beginning to set over the city as Michael Reeves pushed his cleaning cart down the wide corridors of Orion Enterprises. The building's sleek, modern design reflected the ambition of the tech company that occupied its floors. Floor-to-ceiling windows allowed the last rays of sunlight to bathe the offices in a golden hue. But Michael barely noticed. His routine was simple: sweep, mop, empty trash, and wipe down surfaces. It was a job he had been doing for nearly 3 years, and he moved with practiced efficiency. At first glance, Michael looked like an ordinary man in his mid-40s. His salt and pepper hair was neatly trimmed, and his deep-set eyes carried the weight of years lived quietly. He didn't stand out, and that was how he liked it. Most employees in the building passed him by without so much as a second glance. Just another janitor in the background of their high-paced corporate lives. But those who took the time to look deeper might have seen something different. His movements, though deliberate and calm, had a certain precision. His eyes, always alert, scanned the room with a practiced vigilance. Rachel Mitchell, the head of HR, was one of the few who had noticed Michael's subtle aura of control. She had once commented on his calm nature, but Michael had brushed it off with a modest smile, offering no details about the life he had lived before coming to Orion. As Michael swept through the break room, he overheard 2 junior employees talking, their conversation laced with tension. "I'm telling you, if Carter calls me into his office one more time to yell about these deadlines, I'm going to lose it," one of them muttered. "But what can we do? He's the CEO. We just have to deal with it," the other replied, clearly resigned. Michael said nothing as he emptied the trash can nearby, but he listened carefully. He had heard similar complaints from employees before. David Carter, the CEO of Orion, was well known for his ruthless leadership style. He didn't tolerate mistakes, and his sharp tongue often left employees shaken. Michael finished his work in the break room and moved on, his mind wandering briefly to the past. Back to the days when he had been in control of entire operations, where mistakes were not just costly, but deadly. But that life was behind him now. He had left it for good, or so he thought. High above Michael's quiet routine, in the luxurious corner office of the building's top floor, David Carter leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen of his tablet. The numbers on the quarterly report were good. Great even. Profits were up, and Orion Enterprises was on track for another record-breaking year. But for David, it wasn't enough. It was never enough. David was in his early 50s with sharp features and a perpetual scowl etched into his face. His suit, tailored to perfection, hinted at his wealth, and his office, with its pristine glass walls and minimalist decor, spoke of power. He was the kind of man who believed in control over his company, control over his employees, and control over his future. His assistant, Samantha Reed, knocked lightly on the door before stepping inside. She was a young woman in her late 20s, eager to prove herself in the competitive world of corporate America. David barely glanced up from his tablet as she approached. "Mr. Carter," Samantha said hesitantly, "the board meeting is scheduled for tomorrow morning at 9. I've prepared the presentation, but there's a section on employee satisfaction that—" "Cut it," David interrupted sharply, waving his hand dismissively. "We don't need to waste time on that. The board cares about profits, not whether the employees are happy." Samantha's mouth tightened, but she nodded obediently. "Of course, sir. I'll revise it." David finally looked up, his cold blue eyes locking on Samantha. "And make sure you're ready for the meeting. I don't want any mistakes. Last time you stumbled over the numbers. It made us look unprepared." "Yes, Mr. Carter. It won't happen again," she replied, her voice strained. As Samantha left the office, David turned back to his tablet, already dismissing the conversation. Employees were tools, nothing more. If they couldn't handle the pressure, they didn't belong at Orion. David had built this company from the ground up with that philosophy, and it had worked. He had no reason to change it now. The following morning, David Carter strode into the boardroom, his usual air of authority preceding him. The executives seated around the long, polished table straightened in their chairs, their faces tense. David took his place at the head of the table and immediately launched into the meeting, his voice sharp and commanding. "Let's get to the point," he began, flipping through the slides on the screen behind him. "Our profits are up 15% from last quarter, but that's not enough. I want to see a 20% increase by the end of the next quarter. I don't care how we do it, cut costs, push harder, Or fire the dead weight. Just make it happen. The room was silent, the weight of David's words pressing down on the executives. One of them, Tom Green, hesitated before speaking. He was an older man with decades of experience in the industry, but even he wasn't immune to David's wrath. David, Tom began cautiously, we're already pushing our teams pretty hard. Morale is low, and I'm not sure how much more we can... I don't care about morale, Tom, David snapped, cutting him off. If they can't handle the pressure, they don't belong here. We're here to make money, not friends. Tom fell silent, his face flushed with frustration, but he didn't push further. David continued, outlining his aggressive plans for the next quarter. By the time the meeting ended, the executives looked drained, defeated by the sheer force of David's will. As they filed out of the room, David lingered behind, looking out the massive windows that overlooked the city. From this height, the people below looked like ants, small, insignificant, just like the employees who worked for him. Later that evening, as the office began to empty out and the city lights flickered to life, Michael Reeves made his rounds on the executive floor. The polished surfaces of the boardroom glistened under the dim lighting as he quietly swept the floor, his mind miles away. His thoughts drifted back to a time before he had become a janitor, back to when he had been known by another name, in another life. Michael had served in the Special Forces, a career that had defined him for over a decade. He had led teams on dangerous missions, navigating hostile environments and making life-or-death decisions with precision. But after a particularly traumatic mission had gone horribly wrong, leaving most of his team dead, Michael had walked away from that life. The guilt and the weight of the loss had driven him to seek peace in anonymity, far from the chaos of his former world. Now he kept his head down, content to live a quiet life, unnoticed and unbothered. But as he swept the boardroom floor, he couldn't help but feel a stirring in his chest, a sense that, despite his best efforts, the past wasn't as far behind him as he had hoped. As Michael made his way down the hallway, he passed David's office, hearing the CEO's voice raised in anger. David was berating someone over the phone, his tone sharp and biting. "I don't care about your excuses," David snarled. "You have until tomorrow to get it done, or you're fired." Michael paused for a moment, his hand tightening around the handle of his mop. He had seen men like David before, men who believed their power made them invincible, who treated others as disposable. Michael had learned the hard way that such arrogance often led to downfall, but he said nothing. It wasn't his place to intervene. With a quiet sigh, Michael continued down the hall, disappearing into the shadows of the building he had come to know so well. But as he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change, that the life he had tried so hard to leave behind was about to catch up with him. A week later, Orion Enterprises hosted an annual party for employees at an upscale venue downtown. The entire building was buzzing with excitement as staff exchanged whispers about the grand event. For most, it was a rare opportunity to unwind and network outside the office walls, though for many the pressure to impress still lingered. Michael Reeves was there as well, not as a guest, but part of the cleaning staff hired for the night. Dressed in a crisp uniform, he moved quietly through the crowded ballroom, clearing tables and collecting empty glasses. No one paid him much attention, just another background figure, blending into the shadows. David Carter, however, was in his element. The CEO floated around the room, glass of champagne in hand, shaking hands with key clients and board members. His charming smile and polished exterior masked the arrogance and ruthlessness that lay beneath. Most employees avoided getting too close, fearing the wrath that often came with a conversation that didn't go David's way. By the time the night was in full swing, David had had one too many drinks, and his temper was on a short fuse. As he turned sharply to make his way across the ballroom, he collided with Michael, who was carrying a tray of drinks. The tray tilted, and red wine splashed across David's white suit jacket. Time seemed to freeze. David looked down at his ruined suit, his face slowly reddening with fury. The ballroom grew quiet as nearby guests realized what had just happened. Michael stood still, his expression calm and measured, though a flicker of tension passed through his eyes. "You clumsy idiot," David roared, drawing everyone's attention. "Do you have any idea how much this suit costs?" Michael straightened, meeting David's gaze but saying nothing. He calmly set the tray down on a nearby table, making no attempt to justify himself. He could feel the weight of the room's eyes on him, but he wasn't about to bow to this man's anger. David took a step closer, his voice dripping with contempt. "I should fire you right now." "No, scratch that. You're fired. I don't want to see your face in my building ever again. Do you understand me, you useless piece of trash?" Michael's expression didn't change. He simply nodded once, turned and walked away, leaving the ballroom in stunned silence. David stood there, chest heaving with rage, while several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Samantha Reed, David's assistant, looked mortified, but she said nothing. As Michael exited the venue, the cold night air hit his face. He had known that the job at Orion wouldn't last forever, but he hadn't expected it to end like this. He took a deep breath, the steady control that had served him well over the years settling back over him. He wouldn't make a scene. He wouldn't fight. But somewhere in the back of his mind, a dormant part of himself, the part that had led elite teams into combat, stirred. The next morning, Rachel Mitchell, head of HR, was still reeling from the events of the previous night. She had seen the look on Michael's face as David berated him, and it had stuck with her. There was something about the way Michael had handled himself, so calm, so composed, that didn't fit the profile of an ordinary janitor. Feeling a sense of guilt, Rachel decided to reach out to him. After making a few calls, she found out where Michael lived, and by the afternoon, she was standing outside his modest apartment building. When Michael opened the door, he looked surprised to see her, but quickly masked it with a polite smile. "Ms. Mitchell," he greeted, stepping aside to let her in. "I wanted to come by and apologize," Rachel said, stepping into the small living room. "The way David treated you last night, it wasn't right, and I wanted you to know that." Michael shook his head. "There's no need to apologize, it's over now. These things happen." Rachel frowned, studying him. "You're taking this remarkably well. Most people would be furious, especially after what David said." Michael shrugged, remaining nonchalant. "I've learned not to let these things get to me." Rachel's curiosity was piqued. She sat down, watching him carefully. "Michael, if you don't mind me asking, what did you do before working at Orion? You don't seem like someone who's easily rattled." Michael hesitated, his eyes flickering with something Rachel couldn't quite place. "I did some work overseas," he said vaguely, "but that was a long time ago." Rachel didn't press further, sensing that there was more to his story, but she respected his privacy. "Well, if you ever need help finding another job, I'd be happy to assist. You deserve better than what happened last night." Michael smiled slightly, appreciating her kindness. "Thank you, Ms. Mitchell, but I'll be fine. I always find a way." As Rachel left his apartment, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something different about Michael, something she had yet to uncover. Across the city in a dimly lit office, Victor Kane, a notorious crime lord, was finalizing his plans. Victor was known for his cunning and ruthlessness, and his latest target was Orion Enterprises. The company's global connections and financial infrastructure made it the perfect front for laundering money. But to make his plan work, Victor needed control, and he needed it soon. Leaning back in his chair, Victor glanced at the dossier in front of him, filled with details about Orion's CEO, David Carter. Arrogant, power-hungry, and predictable, David was the perfect target. Victor knew that a few subtle threats would be enough to shake David, and then the real fun would begin. "Send the first message," Victor ordered his lieutenant. "Make sure it's personal. I want him to know we're serious." His lieutenant nodded and left the room. Victor's cold smile spread across his face as he imagined the panic that would soon engulf Orion Enterprises. Little did David know, he was about to become a pawn in a much larger game. A few days after the party, Michael found himself walking through the city, reflecting on the events of the past week. He was done with Orion, and although part of him felt a sense of relief, the part that had once thrived on action felt restless. As he passed by the Orion building, he noticed something unusual, a group of men loitering near the entrance. They didn't look like typical employees or clients, and their movements were too calculated to be random. Michael's instincts, honed from years in the field, kicked in. He watched them for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he caught sight of a subtle handoff. A small package passed from one man to another. Something was wrong. Without thinking, Michael approached the building. He knew he had no authority here, But his gut told him that whatever was happening, it wasn't good. He made his way to the side entrance, slipping inside unnoticed. Inside, he found Rachel Mitchell seated at her desk. She looked up, surprised to see him. "Michael?" she asked. "What are you doing here?" "I don't want to alarm you," Michael said quietly, "but something's not right. There are men outside. They're not normal visitors. I think they're watching the building." Rachel frowned, immediately concerned. "Are you sure?" Michael nodded. "I've seen enough to know when something's off." Rachel's mind raced. She had trusted Michael's instincts before, and she knew he wasn't someone who would make baseless claims. "What do we do?" "Keep an eye on things for now," Michael advised. "But if anything else happens, call me. I'm not sure what's going on yet, but I have a feeling this is just the beginning." Rachel agreed, but the unease in her gut told her that Michael was right. Something was coming, and soon. It had been several days since Michael Reeves warned Rachel Mitchell about the suspicious men outside Orion Enterprises. Since then, there had been no further incidents, but Michael's instincts told him that something wasn't right. He had seen these patterns before: surveillance, preparation, then a strike, the calm before the storm. As Rachel sat in her office that evening, going over a pile of HR reports, she couldn't shake the tension in the air. She hadn't shared Michael's concerns with anyone else, not even David Carter, but now she was wondering if she should have. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Footsteps that didn't sound like the usual late-night employees. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and an unsettling stillness fell over the building. Rachel's heart pounded as she slowly rose from her desk, creeping toward the door. She peeked through the small glass window and saw men, heavily armed men, moving through the halls, rounding up employees. The office she had thought of as safe now looked like a trap. Before she could make a move, the door was kicked open with a loud crash. Two masked men barged into her office, guns drawn. "Don't make a sound," one of them growled, grabbing her by the arm and dragging her into the hallway. Rachel's eyes widened as she saw more armed men herding the few remaining employees into the large conference room. Panic set in. These weren't ordinary criminals. They moved with the efficiency and precision of trained operatives. But who were they? And what did they want with Orion Enterprises? Her questions were answered as she was pushed into the conference room, where Victor Kane, the leader of the armed group, stood at the front, a cruel smile playing on his lips. His cold eyes scanned the frightened faces of the employees before landing on Rachel. "Welcome to the party," Victor said mockingly. "I'm sure you're all wondering why we're here. Well, it's simple. Your CEO, David Carter, has something I want, and until I get it, all of you will stay right here." Rachel's mind raced as she processed the gravity of the situation. This wasn't a random attack. It was personal. Meanwhile, Michael Reeves was sitting in his small apartment when his phone buzzed. It was a message from Rachel, just 2 words: "Help us." Michael immediately stood up, adrenaline flooding his veins. He had been waiting for this moment, the one where his instincts would be proven right. Without hesitation, he grabbed the small duffel bag he always kept ready, filled with the tools of his past life, gear he hadn't touched in years. It didn't take long for him to reach the Orion building. The streets were eerily quiet for this time of night, but the moment Michael saw the darkened windows and the presence of unmarked vans parked nearby, he knew the situation had escalated. Moving swiftly and silently, Michael made his way around the side of the building, avoiding the obvious entrances. He had cleaned this building for 3 years. He knew every corner, every hidden access point, and every weak spot in the security system. His familiarity with the layout was about to become his greatest weapon. He entered through a service door in the back, making his way through the lower levels of the building. His movements were precise, his senses heightened. Michael wasn't just a janitor anymore. He was back in the mindset of a Special Forces operative, focused, calm, and ready for whatever lay ahead. Michael's first stop was the security room. It had been hastily abandoned, likely when the armed men took control. He scanned the security feeds, seeing Victor's men patrolling the floors and the hostages gathered in the large conference room. His eyes zeroed in on Rachel, her face pale but determined, seated among the other employees. Michael's mind raced as he formulated a plan. The hostages were the top priority, but he needed to thin out the numbers first. Taking on the entire group at once would be suicide, even for someone with his training. Instead, he would move silently, picking them off one by one. Leaving the security room, Michael made his way to the third floor, where two of Victor's men were patrolling a long, empty hallway. Michael crouched behind a row of cubicles, waiting for the right moment. When one of the men turned his back, Michael struck. Quick, efficient, and silent. Within moments, both men were unconscious, their weapons secured. He moved swiftly through the building, taking out one group of guards after another with the same silent precision. Each takedown was a reminder of the skills he had honed during his years in the field, skills he had once hoped never to use again. But tonight, they were the only thing standing between the hostages and certain death. By the time Michael reached the main office area, he had taken down most of Victor's men, leaving the hostages relatively unguarded. He slipped into the room, his presence going unnoticed at first. Rachel was the first to see him, her eyes widening in disbelief. "Michael?" He placed a finger to his lips, signaling for silence. "Stay calm. I'm going to get you all out of here." Rachel nodded, her mind still struggling to reconcile the quiet janitor she had known with the highly trained operative now standing before her. Michael quickly assessed the situation, instructing the group to stay low and follow him out through a service corridor he had cleared earlier. But before they could move, the door burst open, and two of Victor's men stormed into the room, guns drawn. Without hesitation, Michael reacted. In a blur of movement, he disarmed one of the men and engaged the other in hand-to-hand combat. The fight was brief but intense, with Michael's years of training giving him the upper hand. Within moments, both men were incapacitated. The hostages watched in stunned silence as Michael stood over the fallen guards, breathing heavily. He turned to Rachel, his voice calm. "Let's move." Upstairs in the CEO's office, David Carter sat bound to a chair, his face pale as Victor Kane paced back and forth in front of him. "You've built quite the empire here, Mr. Carter," Victor said, his tone mocking. "Too bad it's all about to come crashing down." David tried to keep his composure, but his mind was racing. He had never imagined he would be in this kind of situation, held hostage in his own building, powerless to stop what was happening. "What do you want?" David asked, his voice shaky. Victor stopped pacing and leaned in close, his cold eyes locking onto David's. "What I want is simple. You're going to give me control of Orion Enterprises. I'll use your company to move my money, and in return, you and your employees get to live. Refuse, and I'll burn this place to the ground." David's heart pounded in his chest. He had always been in control, always able to manipulate and bully his way out of problems. But now he was helpless. His mind flashed back to the moment he had fired Michael at the party. If only he had known then that his arrogance would lead him here. Victor's patience was wearing thin. "Make your choice, Mr. Carter. Your time is running out." David swallowed hard, his mind spinning as he tried to think of a way out. But before he could respond, the sound of gunfire echoed through the building, followed by the distant crash of doors being kicked open. Victor straightened, his expression darkening. "It seems we have a problem." In this section, we see the full scope of the threat as Victor and his men take control of Orion Enterprises, with David and the employees held hostage. Michael's transformation from janitor to Special Forces operative is now fully in motion as he begins his silent rescue of the hostages. The tension continues to rise as David, once in control, is now faced with the consequences of his arrogance. As Victor Kane stormed through the halls of Orion Enterprises, gun drawn, the growing realization that something had gone terribly wrong began to settle in. His men were highly trained, not easily rattled, but one by one, they were falling silent. He had expected David Carter to be easy prey, his company ripe for takeover. Yet now chaos was spreading through the building, and he still didn't know why. Victor reached for his radio, barking orders to the few remaining men. "Check in. What's happening on the lower floors?" Static greeted him, followed by a garbled, panicked response. "He's picking us off one by one. It's like he's everywhere." The line went dead. Victor clenched his jaw. Whoever was causing this disruption was no ordinary security guard. Someone with serious training was in the building, and they were systematically dismantling his operation. His mind raced as he tried to figure out who could possibly be responsible. Could it be an ex-military contractor? The police wouldn't be this effective, not this quickly. He stopped in front of the CEO's office, where David Carter was still bound to his chair. The CEO's smugness had been replaced with fear, but now as he saw Victor's agitation, a flicker of hope appeared in David's eyes. Victor stepped closer, leaning in until his face was inches from David's. "You knew about this, didn't you?" David blinked in confusion. "Knew about what?" "The man picking off my crew," Victor hissed. "Who is he?" David frowned. I don't know what you're talking about." Victor's patience snapped. He grabbed David by the collar, jerking him forward. "Don't play games with me, Carter. Who did you call? Who's doing this?" David's mind raced. He had no idea who could be capable of such a thing, but the answer came to him in a sudden, startling flash. Michael Reeves, the janitor he had fired at the company party, the man who had walked away with an eerie calm that night. David had written him off as insignificant, but now the pieces were starting to come together. "I think it's Michael," David stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Michael?" Victor repeated, his brow furrowing. "The janitor?" David nodded, the realization dawning on him with a mix of disbelief and regret. "He's not just a janitor. There's more to him. I think he used to be military." Victor released David, a cold smile creeping across his face. "Military, huh? Well, that makes things interesting." He turned toward the door, motioning for his men to follow. "Find him. Bring him to me alive." On the other side of the building, Michael Reeves had successfully escorted the hostages, including Rachel Mitchell, to safety in a secure part of the building. But his mission wasn't over. Victor was still in control of the building, and Michael knew that until the criminal leader was stopped, no one would be truly safe. As the group of hostages huddled in a dark hallway, Rachel approached Michael, her expression a mixture of gratitude and concern. "You saved us," she whispered, "but what now? They're still out there." Michael nodded, his mind already working on the next step. "I need to finish this. Victor won't stop until he's taken out." Rachel's brow furrowed in worry. "But there's only one of you. You can't take them all on by yourself." "I've handled worse," Michael replied, his voice steady. "This isn't my first time in a situation like this." Rachel studied him for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. She had always sensed there was something different about Michael, something that set him apart from everyone else. But now she was starting to understand the depth of his experience, the kind of life he had led before he became a janitor. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. "You could have just walked away." Michael met her gaze, his eyes calm but intense. "Because it's the right thing to do. And because people like Victor don't stop unless someone stops them." Rachel didn't argue. She could see that Michael had made up his mind. "Just be careful, okay?" Michael gave her a small smile, the first one she had seen all night. "I will." With that, he turned and disappeared into the shadows of the building, leaving Rachel and the others behind. The building was eerily quiet as Michael made his way toward the top floor, where Victor and his remaining men were holed up. The air was thick with tension, and every step Michael took was calculated, his senses on high alert. He had trained for situations like this, situations where one wrong move could mean the difference between life and death. As he approached the CEO's office, Michael paused, taking in the layout of the hallway. 2 men were stationed outside the door, their weapons drawn. Michael's mind worked quickly, analyzing their positions and formulating a plan. He couldn't afford to make any noise now, not when he was so close to the end. In one fluid motion, Michael moved forward, taking out the first guard with a precise strike to the neck. Before the second guard could react, Michael disarmed him, sending him crashing to the floor. The fight was over in seconds, and Michael slipped inside the office without a sound. Inside, Victor Kane was waiting. The room was dimly lit, and Victor stood near the large windows, his back to Michael. He didn't turn around as Michael entered, but his voice was calm, almost amused. "I've been expecting you," Victor said, his tone dripping with mockery. "Michael Reeves, the janitor. Or should I say, the ex-military operative." Michael stepped forward, his eyes locked on Victor. "It's over, Kane. Your men are down. Surrender now, and this doesn't have to end badly." Victor turned, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Oh, I don't think so, Michael. You see, I always have a plan, and right now, I'm holding all the cards." With a flick of his wrist, Victor pulled out a detonator from his jacket pocket, his thumb hovering over the button. This building is rigged to blow. One press of this button, and everyone inside dies. Michael's heart pounded in his chest, but his expression remained calm. He had dealt with men like Victor before, men who believed that violence and fear made them invincible. But Michael knew better. There was always a way out. "You won't make it out alive either," Michael said, his voice steady. "This isn't a win for you." Victor's smile didn't falter. "Maybe not, but if I go down, I'm taking you all with me." The two men stared each other down, the tension in the room palpable. Michael's mind raced, searching for a way to disarm the situation without triggering the bomb. He had one chance, and he couldn't afford to miss. In a flash, Michael moved, launching himself at Victor with lightning speed. The two men grappled, each fighting for control of the detonator. Michael's military training kicked in, and within moments, he had Victor pinned to the floor, the detonator knocked out of his hand. Victor struggled beneath him, but Michael's grip was unyielding. "It's over, Kane," he said, his voice low. Victor let out a bitter laugh. "You think this ends with me? There will always be another." Michael tightened his hold, his voice cold. "Maybe, but tonight it ends with you." With one final decisive move, Michael secured Victor, rendering him immobile. The detonator lay harmlessly on the floor, the threat neutralized. The sun was beginning to rise as the first police sirens wailed outside Orion Enterprises. The building was surrounded by law enforcement, news vans, and a growing crowd of onlookers. Inside, the remaining hostages were being escorted out by police officers, their faces etched with relief. Michael stood by the main entrance, watching as the chaos slowly began to settle. He had stayed behind to make sure everything was secure, but now that the threat was over, the familiar calmness began to return. It was over. As he watched the police lead Victor Kane away in handcuffs, Michael felt a strange mix of emotions. Satisfaction, certainly, but also a deep weariness. This wasn't the life he had wanted anymore. He had left the world of violence and danger behind for a reason. But tonight, he had been reminded that sometimes the past has a way of catching up with you. Rachel Mitchell approached him, her expression one of gratitude and awe. "You did it," she said softly. "You saved us." Michael gave a small nod. Just doing what needed to be done. Rachel studied him for a moment, her curiosity still burning. "Who are you, really?" Michael met her gaze, his eyes tired but kind. "Just a man trying to make things right." Rachel smiled, a look of understanding passing between them. "Thank you, Michael, for everything." Before he could respond, David Carter appeared, flanked by several police officers. His face was pale and he looked shaken, but there was also a newfound humility in his expression. He approached Michael slowly, almost cautiously. I don't know how to thank you," David stammered. "What you did tonight, it's beyond anything I could have imagined." Michael remained silent, his gaze steady. David swallowed hard, guilt flashing across his face. "I was wrong about you, Michael. I treated you badly. And for that, I'm sorry." Michael gave a small nod of acknowledgement. "We all make mistakes." David hesitated for a moment, then offered a tentative smile. "If you ever want your job back, or if you want something more, something that fits your skills, I'd be happy to make it happen." Michael shook his head gently. "Thank you, but no. I'm done with this life." David looked confused. "But what will you do now?" Michael turned his gaze to the city skyline, the rising sun casting a warm glow over the horizon. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'll figure it out." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Orion Enterprises behind. Rachel and David watched him go, both of them knowing that they would never forget the man who had quietly walked their halls for years, the man who had saved them all. Weeks had passed since the events at Orion Enterprises, and life in the city had slowly returned to normal. The news had been abuzz with stories of the daring rescue, though Michael Reeves had managed to keep his name out of the headlines. He preferred it that way. He had found a small, quiet place on the edge of the city, a place where he could finally get some peace. The world he had once known was behind him now, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of calm. But deep down, Michael knew that this wouldn't be the last time his skills would be called upon. There would always be people like Victor Kane, people who needed to be stopped. And though he didn't seek out danger, he knew that when the time came, he would be ready. For now, though, he would enjoy the quiet. Several months had passed since the incident at Orion Enterprises, and the company was slowly rebuilding its reputation. The building itself had been repaired, the damage from Victor Kane's attack now a distant memory. But for the people who had been there that night, the memories remained vivid. David Carter sat in his office, his gaze drifting out the window as he thought about everything that had happened. The company he had once ruled with an iron fist had changed, and so had he. David wasn't the same arrogant CEO who had dismissed people like Michael Reeves as insignificant. He had learned a hard lesson that night about leadership, humility, and the value of every individual in his company. Rachel Mitchell, now promoted to head of HR, had played a key role in helping the company heal. She had organized counseling sessions for the employees, provided support for those who had been most affected, and worked closely with David to create a more positive, inclusive company culture. Together, they had implemented new policies to ensure that every employee felt valued and heard, something that had been sorely lacking before. But there was one person whose absence was felt more deeply than anyone else's: Michael Reeves. David had tried to contact Michael several times after the incident, hoping to thank him properly and offer him a role in the company's security team. But each time, Michael had politely declined. He wasn't interested in returning to Orion Enterprises, and though David respected his decision, he couldn't help but feel a sense of regret. Michael had saved his life, saved all of their lives, and yet he had walked away without asking for anything in return. As David sat at his desk, reflecting on the changes he had made, Rachel entered the office holding a stack of reports. "The new training programs are starting next week," she said, placing the papers on his desk. "I think it's going to make a real difference." David nodded, offering a small smile. "Thanks, Rachel. I don't think we could have gotten through all this without you." Rachel returned the smile, then hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Have you heard from Michael?" David shook his head, a flicker of disappointment crossing his face. "Number I've tried, but I think he's moved on." Rachel nodded slowly, understanding. "He's a man of few words, but I think he knows how much we appreciate what he did." David sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I just wish I could have told him in person." Meanwhile, Michael Reeves had found his peace in the quiet outskirts of the city. After the events at Orion, he had left the company behind, choosing instead to live a simpler, quieter life. He had purchased a small home by a lake, far away from the noise and chaos of the city, and spent his days tending to his garden, reading, and enjoying the solitude. But even in the peaceful surroundings, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that he was still being called to something greater. The skills he had honed over the years, the training, the discipline, the instinct for danger, had been awakened that night at Orion. And though he wasn't seeking out conflict, he knew that there would always be a need for people like him. One evening, as the sun began to set over the lake, Michael received an unexpected visitor. A black SUV pulled up to the front of his house, and as Michael stepped outside, he saw a man in a suit step out of the vehicle. The man was tall, with graying hair and a serious expression. He walked toward Michael with purpose, extending his hand in greeting. "Mr. Reeves," the man said, his voice calm but authoritative, "my name is Daniel Pierce. I'm with a special government division. We've been monitoring your situation for some time." Michael raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms over his chest. "What situation?" Daniel smiled faintly. "Your actions at Orion Enterprises didn't go unnoticed. We've reviewed the footage, spoken to witnesses. What you did that night, single-handedly taking down a group of armed men, wasn't something an ordinary man could have done. You've got training, Mr. Reeves. Military, I assume." Michael didn't answer, his expression remaining impassive. Daniel continued, "We're in need of someone with your skill set. Someone who can handle high-risk operations with discretion and precision. You'd be working off the grid. No official records, no public recognition. But the work you'd be doing would make a real difference." Michael stared at him for a long moment, his mind racing. The offer was tempting in some ways, but he had spent years trying to leave that life behind. He wasn't sure if he wanted to be pulled back into that world of danger and secrecy. "I'm not interested," Michael said finally, turning to head back inside. Daniel's voice stopped him. We don't take no for an answer easily, Mr. Reeves, but we respect your decision for now. If you ever change your mind, you know how to reach us. Michael didn't respond. He watched as Daniel climbed back into the SUV and drove away, leaving him alone once again. For the first time since the Orion incident, Michael felt a flicker of uncertainty. He had made his choice to walk away, but part of him wondered if there was still something more he was meant to do. A few days later, as Michael sat by the lake, the quiet evening air was interrupted by the sound of his phone buzzing. It was a message from Rachel Mitchell. "We miss you around here. Hope you're doing well. Take care, Michael." Michael stared at the message for a long time before typing a short reply. "I'm doing well. Take care, Rachel." He put the phone down, feeling a strange sense of closure. Rachel and David had both reached out to him, expressing their gratitude in their own ways, and though he had chosen not to return to Orion, he felt at peace with the decision. But the message from Rachel also reminded him of something important: the relationships he had built, even in his quiet life as a janitor. Michael had always kept people at a distance, but over time he had grown to care about those around him. He had saved them not just because it was the right thing to do, but because they had become part of his life, even if he hadn't realized it at the time. That night, as Michael sat by the water, he made a decision. He wouldn't return to the life of high-risk operations that Daniel Pierce had offered him, but he also wouldn't turn his back on the world completely. There were ways to help people, to make a difference without losing himself in the process. The next morning, Michael reached out to an old friend from his military days, someone who had started a nonprofit organization to help veterans transition back into civilian life. It was a small organization focused on mentorship and community support, and Michael thought it might be a good place to start. He had spent years running from his past, but now he was ready to face it. Not as a soldier, not as a janitor, but as someone who had learned to find balance between the two. Back at Orion Enterprises, life had returned to a new kind of normal. The company was stronger than ever, its employees more connected and supportive of one another. The changes David Carter and Rachel Mitchell had implemented were paying off, and the toxic culture that had once plagued the company was gone. David had learned to lead with humility, and Rachel had become a trusted advisor, helping to shape the future of the company in ways she hadn't imagined before. Together, they had built something new, something better. One afternoon, as Rachel sat at her desk, she received a call from an unknown number. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello? Hey, Rachel." Her heart skipped a beat. "Michael? Is that you?" Michael's voice was calm and familiar. "I just wanted to check in, make sure everything's going well." Rachel smiled, her heart lifting. "Things are good. The company's doing well, and David's changed a lot, thanks to you." "I didn't do much," Michael replied modestly. "You did more than you think," Rachel said. "You saved us, literally and figuratively." There was a brief pause on the line before Michael spoke again. "I'm glad to hear that. Listen, if you ever need anything, I'm here." Rachel felt a warmth spread through her chest. "Thank you, Michael. We'll always be grateful for what you did." Michael chuckled softly. "Take care, Rachel. You too," she said, her voice soft. As the call ended, Rachel sat back in her chair, a sense of peace washing over her. Michael had moved on, but his presence would always be felt at Orion Enterprises. He had changed all of their lives in ways they could never fully express. Michael Reeves stood at the edge of the lake, watching the sun set over the water. The world was quiet, the air crisp and clean. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace, not because he had turned his back on the world, but because he had found a way to move forward. He didn't know what the future held, but he was ready for whatever came next. Whether it was helping others in small, quiet ways or facing bigger challenges down the line, Michael knew he had a purpose, and for now, that was enough. As the sun set on Michael Reeves's quiet retreat by the lake, one thing was certain: his journey wasn't over. He had saved countless lives at Orion Enterprises, found peace with his past, and uncovered a new sense of purpose. Whether he would return to the world of high-risk operations or continue helping people in more subtle ways, only time would tell. But one thing was clear: Michael was no ordinary janitor, and his legacy would live on in the hearts of those he had touched. Thank you for watching this incredible story of redemption, action, and transformation. If Michael Reeves's journey inspired you or made you think about the quiet heroes around us, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories just like this. We post new videos daily, so don't miss out. Subscribe now and turn on notifications to stay updated on all of our latest content. We'd also love to hear your thoughts on Michael's story, so drop a comment below and let us know. What would you have done in Michael's shoes? Until next time, stay inspired and remember, heroes come from the most unexpected places.